Still can't fall asleep? No problem. Come here. I will tell you a story. Sleep well. The second night came softly, as all nights do, not rushing, not forcing itself upon the world, but unfolding in its own time, as though the forest itself had prepared for it. The trees leaned a little closer together, as if conferring quietly with one another, their leaves whispering in the dusk. The air was cooler than before, touched by a faint edge of mountain breath, and the path that wound back toward the clearing seemed narrower now, as though the forest had grown more watchful, more secretive in the hours between the first night and this one. The elder was there, waiting, as though he had never left the fire's side. His posture was calm, steady, as if he himself had become part of the circle of stones around the flames. When you approached, the fire greeted you first, rising with a soft flare, like a friend who had been resting and now stirs awake to welcome your return. "Ah," the elder said, his voice carrying the warmth of the fire itself. "You have returned, and so has the fire, and so has the forest. Everything is as it should be." He gestured to the spot by the flames, the place where you had sat the night before, the place warmed now by memory as much as by heat. "Sit, settle. The night is ours again. The forest has prepared and the fire is eager. It knows you now. It remembers your presence, your breath, your stillness. Fires have long memories, you see, longer than ours. They carry with them the sparks of every flame that ever was. Tonight, it will show us more." The flames bent slightly in the direction of the elder's hand, as if in agreement. Sparks leapt upward, dissolving into the deepening sky. The circle of warmth wrapped itself gently around you, holding you steady against the cool edges of night. The elder leaned forward, gazing into the heart of the fire. His eyes reflected the glow, shimmering like coals. His voice, when it came, was slower even than before, each word chosen with care, each silence held long enough for you to sink deeper into it. "Tonight," he began, "we step deeper into the forest, not with our feet, though that path may call to us, and perhaps one night we shall walk it, but with our minds, with our listening. There are places in the forest that only reveal themselves when we are patient enough, still enough, quiet enough. Tonight, we will learn to hear them." He paused, letting the fire's crackle fill the space, letting the night settle around his words. Then he continued. "There once was a traveler who thought the forest was silent. He came from the city, where noise was constant, and when he first entered the woods, he thought he'd found true silence. But as he stayed, as he lingered, he began to hear more: the creak of branches, the sigh of wind through leaves, the distant call of an owl, the faint scurrying of creatures in the undergrowth. The forest was not silent at all. It was alive, speaking in voices too soft, too subtle for those who rushed. And when he finally stilled himself, when he gave the forest the gift of his patience, he heard even more: the rhythm of sap in the trees, the breath of moss upon stone, the whisper of soil shifting beneath roots. He learned that silence is not emptiness, but fullness, too deep for hurried ears. The elder looked at you, eyes bright in the firelight. And so it is tonight. We must listen not only to what is obvious, but to what lies beneath, behind, between. That is how the deeper forest reveals itself. He stretched his hands toward the flames, palms open, as though receiving warmth directly into his bones. Close your eyes if you wish, and listen with more than your ears. The fire is speaking. The forest is speaking. Let us hear together. For a long time, there was no voice but the fire's. It shifted, cracked, sent tiny showers of sparks spiraling upward. The night air carried faint scents of pine, damp earth, and wood smoke. Somewhere beyond the clearing, an owl hooted once, then again, its call low and solemn. The elder did not break the silence. He let it unfold, let it deepen, let it become its own story. When he finally spoke, his voice was almost a whisper. There is a path, he said, that begins where silence becomes sound. A path only the patient can walk. The traveler who heard the forest's hidden voices learned to follow them step by step. And as he did, the forest revealed its stories. Not unlike these flames, glowing quietly, waiting for someone to tend them, someone to listen. The flames leaned higher, golden tongues curling toward the night sky. The elder's voice followed the rhythm of the flames. Another tale, he said softly. There once was a child who could not sleep. Every night she lay awake, restless, while her family drifted into dreams. One evening, an elder, much like myself perhaps, brought her to the edge of a campfire. Watch, he said, and she did. She watched the flames twist and dance, watched the sparks rise and vanish, watched the embers glow and fade. And in that watching, she felt her own breath slow, her own thoughts soften, her own restlessness grow quiet. The fire became her lullaby, and sleep came gently at last. From then on, whenever she could not rest, she would sit by a fire, and it would guide her inward until dreams welcomed her home. The elder looked at you again, the faintest smile at the corners of his mouth. Perhaps you know that feeling now. Perhaps you feel it even as I speak. That is the gift of flame. It teaches rest. It teaches patience. It teaches the art of letting go. He let the silence return, filling the clearing once more. The forest seemed to lean in, listening with you. Tonight, the elder said after a time, we are not alone. The trees listen. The stars watch. The wind carries word of our gathering. Remember this. Every story told by fire becomes part of the forest itself. Each word rises like a spark, vanishes from sight, but lingers in the great canopy above. That is why stories are never lost. That is why we, too, are never lost, so long as the fire still burns, so long as the forest still stands.
The flames shifted, a log collapsing inward, sending a brief flare of light against the elder's face. He looked older in that moment, but not weaker, rather older like the trees, filled with patience, endurance, and quiet strength. You may wonder, he said softly, what lies deeper in the forest. You may wonder what the next night will bring, but wonder is good. Wonder is the beginning of all journeys. For now, let it rest in your heart like a coal, glowing quietly, waiting for the right breath to stir it into flame. He leaned back, drawing his cloak tighter around him. The fire settled, glowing steady, casting its warm, rhythmic light. The forest exhaled slowly, and the night pressed close, gentle, protective, unhurried. "Breathe with the forest now," the elder whispered. "Breathe with the fire, and let the night carry you deeper, deeper, deeper still." The rest of the night unfolded in stillness. The fire burned low, steady, unbroken. The elder did not speak again for a long while, but his presence was felt in every flicker of flame, in every shift of wind, in every slow, patient rhythm of the forest. And though the words ceased, the story continued. Within the fire, within the trees, within the quiet beating of your own heart. The second night had only begun. The night deepened, though it did so in a way that was soft and unhurried, as though time itself was content to stretch and breathe along with the fire. The trees around the clearing bent inward just enough to seem like watchful listeners, their outlines dark against the faint shimmer of stars above. The fire spoke in its own language, steady and unbroken, the sound of wood turning into light, of heat made visible. The elder sat as before, calm, patient, as though he had never left his place by the flames. He did not speak immediately, for he knew that silence was as much a teacher as words. He let the crackle of the fire and the hush of the forest settle into you until you felt as though your own heartbeat was aligned with theirs. Only then did he lean forward, eyes bright with reflected firelight. "Tonight," he said, his voice low and steady, "we continue deeper, not with steps, not yet, but with listening. The forest keeps its secrets well, but for those who return night after night, it reveals more. You have come back, and so the forest trusts you a little more. Tonight, it will let us hear things not heard before." The fire flared briefly, as though confirming his words, and sparks floated upward like a small constellation being born and fading, all within the same breath. "There are paths through the forest," the elder continued, "that do not appear on maps. They cannot be measured in distance or marked with stones. They exist in the spaces between sounds, in the silences between thoughts. Only those who learn to wait can walk them, for they are paths of patience, not of haste." He paused, leaning back, letting the fire's rhythm carry the words deeper. He said, "A long time ago, there was a wanderer who believed he could know the forest simply by walking through it. He marched from dawn until night, moving quickly, believing that distance would reveal truth. But though he covered many miles, he heard nothing, learned nothing. The forest did not speak to him, for he had yet not learned to be still. One evening, weary from his efforts, he sat by a fire much like this one. For the first time, he did not try to move, did not try to force his way forward. He simply sat. And in that sitting, the forest began to speak, first with the call of an owl, then with the shifting of branches, then with the whisper of wind moving gently through the leaves. The longer he sat, the more he heard, until finally he realized that the forest had always been speaking. He had simply been too hurried to listen. That night was his true beginning, though he had walked for weeks before it. And from then on, every step he took was guided not by haste, but by attention. The elder let the story rest in the air, like embers hovering before they faded into the night. Then he said softly, "And so it is with us. Tonight we do not rush. Tonight we let the fire and the forest guide us. The stories will rise like sparks, drift for a while, and then vanish into the sky. That is their nature. And in that rising and vanishing, they leave behind a warmth that stays with us, just as the memory of fire lingers long after the flames are gone." The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks into the air. The elder smiled faintly. "Do you hear that?" he asked. "That is the fire agreeing. It too remembers the wanderer, and it too knows that listening is the first step into the deeper forest." For a long time he was silent again, content to let the forest fill the clearing with its quiet sounds. You could hear the faint scurrying of some small creature through the underbrush, the distant rustle of wings overhead, the soft sigh of night air weaving between trunks and branches. Each sound seemed to grow clearer the longer you listened, as though the forest was rewarding your patience with deeper layers of itself.
When the elder spoke again, his tone was softer still, almost like a dream slipping into words. "There was once a village," he said, "that sat at the edge of the forest. The people there knew the woods well enough for hunting and gathering, but few ever ventured deep. They believed the heart of the forest was too mysterious, too difficult to reach. Only the oldest among them, an elder woman with hair the color of ash, would sometimes speak of what lay beyond. She told them that in the heart of the forest there was a fire that never went out, a flame that had burned since the first dawn. She said it was tended not by hands, but by the forest itself, that the wind kept it breathing, that the trees shielded it, that the earth fed it from below. Most laughed at her stories, calling them children's tales, but some listened. And those who listened began to hear the forest differently. For them, even the smallest flame at their hearth became a reminder of something greater, something eternal. They did not need to see the eternal fire to believe in it. It was enough to feel its echo in every flame they kindled." The elder turned his gaze back to the fire before you, his eyes reflecting its glow. "Perhaps," he said, "this fire we sit beside tonight is one of those echoes. Perhaps it carries within it a spark of that first flame, the one that never dies. Fires are like that, you know. Each flame is born from another, carried through time, hand to hand, branch to branch, log to log. In that way, every fire is connected, every fire remembers. And so, when we sit here, we are not only with this flame, but with every flame that has ever burned, past and present together." The thoughts seemed to linger in the clearing, held aloft by the fire's glow. "You see," the elder continued, "nights like this are not only about stories, they are about remembering what is already within you. The forest is not outside you, nor is the fire. They live in your breath, in your heartbeat, in the warmth you carry with you. Tonight is not a lesson to be learned, but a reminder to be felt. And if you listen closely enough, you will hear the forest reminding you of who you are, and the fire reminding you of what you carry." He leaned back again, drawing his cloak tighter. The night pressed closer,
though not with menace, but with intimacy, as though the forest itself wanted to be part of the circle. The stars above glimmered faintly through the branches, silent witnesses to all that passed below. You will not understand everything tonight. You do not need to. It is enough to sit, to breathe, to listen. That is how the path deepens, step by step, night by night. Trust that the forest reveals what it chooses when it chooses. Trust that the fire will guide you forward, one spark at a time. And with that, he fell silent again, letting the rhythm of the night take over. The fire shifted, the forest breathed, the stars moved slowly in their eternal arcs. The story continued even without words, in the simple act of being present, of sitting together in the circle of light and warmth. The second night stretched on, open, patient, waiting for more to unfold. The fire had burned down into a quiet bed of coals, glowing like a cluster of patient stars at our feet. The older man had shifted a little closer to it, stretching his hands toward the heat, and the sparks that occasionally leapt upward cast fleeting constellations in the darkness. Around us, the forest had grown even more hushed, as if listening, holding its breath. The night was deep now, and though fatigue pressed against my eyelids, I remained anchored in the sound of his voice, steady, low, carrying the weight of memory. He told of walking deeper into the woods the next morning after their first night. The group had risen slowly, each of them brushing off the dew that had collected on their blankets, moving stiffly, as if they had been remade overnight into creaking wooden figures. The air was cool, still rich with that misty silver light that clings to everything in the hours just after dawn. He described how they gathered their few belongings, not with any rush, but with the quiet purpose of people who knew the day would be long, and who wanted to savor every step rather than hurry through it. As they packed, birds began to stir overhead. Small calls at first, hesitant, testing the morning, and then louder, brighter, until it felt like the forest itself had awakened, stretching its wings and letting music fill the trees. The man's words painted the sound so vividly that I imagined myself there, tightening the straps on a pack, while unseen wings flickered overhead, leaves trembling with life. They walked slowly, not on any trail, but through the thick carpet of pine needles that softened their steps. The air carried the faint resinous scent of sap, mixed with earth that had been cooled by the night. Each step seemed to release more fragrance from the soil. He remembered how the youngest among them, still full of restless energy, darted ahead at times, only to stop and wait when the others lagged. They were not hurrying. There was no need. The forest stretched on, endless and generous, offering space and silence enough for all their thoughts. By midday, they reached a clearing, and the sunlight poured down unobstructed for hours afterward. He spoke of how they had stood there in awe, their eyes almost overwhelmed by the brightness after so long under the canopy. Grass swayed gently in the center of the open space, touched by the wind in soft waves. They dropped their packs and lay down, letting the warmth soak into their faces, the clouds drift lazily overhead. For a while, no one spoke. They didn't need to. The clearing had its own voice, one that hummed quietly with life, one that made words unnecessary. I found myself breathing more slowly as he described it, as though I too had stretched out on that grass, watching the endless drift of white against blue. The forest had no urgency. Time itself seemed softened there, the hours stretching wide enough to contain whatever thoughts drifted in. They dozed, dreamed, and let themselves be part of that greater stillness. When hunger nudged them awake, they built a small fire at the edge of the clearing.
He described how carefully they gathered twigs, how deliberate their movements had become, not rushed, not careless, but as though each act had meaning. Fire came slowly, coaxed from spark to flame, and when at last it caught, the smoke rose straight into the sky, carrying with it the fragrance of resin and dry grass. They cooked simply, little more than bread warmed on sticks, and yet he swore it had been a feast. Hunger sharpened every bite, and the silence of the clearing seemed to bless the meal, making it sacred in its own way. He paused here in his telling, his eyes half closed, as though reliving the taste of that humble bread. The coals before us glowed steadily, answering his stillness with their own patient breath. I could almost taste the crisp edge of fire-toasted bread, smell the faint scorch of it blending with the smoke. Afterward, they lingered in the clearing until the light began to turn gold. Shadows stretched, the air cooled, and a kind of agreement passed among them without words. It was time to move again. They rose, gathered their things, and slipped once more into the forest. The canopy closed overhead like a curtain, shading them from the last bright hours of day. The path they made was uneven, guided only by instinct and the position of the sun. Sometimes they stumbled over roots, sometimes they had to push aside undergrowth that clung stubbornly to their legs. And yet there was no sense of struggle in the way he told it. Rather, it was a kind of partnership with the forest, the trees offering resistance, the ground testing them, the air thickening and thinning with the lay of the land. They moved as guests, not conquerors, adjusting themselves to the rhythm of the woods. As the evening deepened, they found themselves descending toward the sound of water, at first faint, like a whisper carried on the wind, and then stronger, until the rush of a stream filled their ears. When at last they broke through a tangle of alder and birch, they saw it, a ribbon of clear water tumbling over rocks, catching the last light and scattering it into fragments. They drank greedily, washing their faces in the coolness, feeling the day's weight slipped from their shoulders. One of them laughed, not out of amusement, but from sheer relief, and soon all of them were laughing, their voices tumbling with the water, dissolving into the dusk. The old man's voice slowed here, softened, as though he too were rinsed by that stream. The sound of the coals, shifting under their own weight, filled the space between us. For a moment, it felt as though time itself had thinned, as though I was hearing the echo of laughter that had once rippled across water decades before, carried to me through memory and night air. And then, gently, he began again. The stream, cool and untamed, had been their gift at the end of a long day. They had lingered there, filling their canteens, letting the water rush across their wrists until their fingers numbed. The forest had given them silence all day, but the stream brought sound, a living, ceaseless murmur that seemed to tell them stories in a language they almost understood. They made camp a little upstream, where a fallen tree offered a natural bench, smoothed by time and weather. The man described the way the firelight played against the bark, gleaming faintly on the pale strands of moss that hung like tattered ribbons. They settled in for the night, weary but content, the fire painting their faces in amber and shadow. But it was then, in the deepening quiet, that something changed. Not a disruption, not yet, just a difference. The forest, so familiar in its silence, now held a note that wasn't there before. At first he had thought it was the stream itself, perhaps a shift in its current. But no, the water sang steadily, unchanged. This was something beneath that song, a second thread in the tapestry of sound, almost hidden. It came and went, faint, like a footstep pressed carefully against leaves, then gone, then again, farther off. He told it slowly, his voice lowering, his eyes reflecting the embers, so that for a moment I could almost see the figures of his younger companions leaning closer to the fire, each of them listening, their breath held. No one wanted to speak of it, not at first. To name it would have been to invite it closer. Instead, they watched the darkness beyond the fire's glow, each of them straining to decide if what they had heard was real. The night pressed in, soft but heavy, as though the trees themselves were listening with them. Then at last, the youngest whispered, "Did you hear that?" The sound came again, as if an answer, not rushing, not bold, just a suggestion of movement, careful, testing.
They could not see anything beyond the circle of their firelight, but they felt it. The way presence can be felt without sight. The way the air seemed to hold more weight in one direction than another. And though fatigue tugged at their eyes, none of them laid down just yet. They sat a little straighter, their laughter gone, their voices hushed, their bodies angled subtly toward the unseen. The older man's voice softened into a near whisper as he told it to me. We thought it was an animal, of course, a deer maybe, curious about our fire, or a fox bold enough to linger. But there was a rhythm to it. That was the strange part. Not the quick, light scurry of paws, not the careful test of hooves. It was slower, more deliberate. The forest gave nothing away. No sudden crash of branches, no eyes gleaming from the shadows. Only that occasional weight on the leaves, pausing, then moving again, never quite close, never quite gone. When at last exhaustion claimed them, they lay down beside the fire, though sleep was fitful. The sound faded into the night, or perhaps into their dreams. Yet one by one, they drifted into uneasy rest, the stream murmuring, the fire whispering, the forest holding its secrets. The man paused, looking into the coals between us as though weighing how much to reveal. His voice was steady, but the way he leaned forward, elbows on knees, suggested that memory still lived near the surface. "In the morning," he said at last, "we found the prints." He did not describe them right away. Instead, he let silence settle between us, so that the fire's faint crackle filled the space and the night pressed closer. My own breath seemed louder than before, and I realized my fingers had curled unconsciously into the blanket around my shoulders. He said they weren't deer nor fox, too large for either. Human, we thought at first, but barefoot and too wide, too heavy, as though whoever or whatever had passed that way carried more weight than a man should. He let the words trail off, the image left unfinished, lingering in the mind like a shadow at the edge of sight. The forest around us seemed to listen too,
its branches creaking softly in the night air. And then he leaned back, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "But that," he said, "is a story for another stretch of the night." The fire had burned low by then, though the coals still glowed with steady warmth. His voice, too, seemed to carry some of that glow, soft, measured, flickering between calm memory and the shadow of unease. Morning had come for them slowly, he said, the mist lifting like a veil as the sun threaded its way through the branches. They had risen stiffly from their makeshift beds, stretching their arms, rubbing their eyes. The stream still sang nearby, unchanged, innocent. But it was the ground that drew their attention. Soft patches of earth between roots, damp enough to hold impressions. That was when they saw them. At first just one, the faint press of something broad and unmistakably shaped like a foot. Bare, heavy, the heel deep enough to speak of weight, the toes splayed wider than they should have been. Then another, angled slightly as if circling the camp, and another. A faint trail winding just at the edge of the fire's glow. He described the way they stood around it in silence, their breath clouding faintly in the cool air. None of them wanted to speak first, for fear that words might make it too real. It was not simply that the prints were there, it was that they had not heard anyone approach close enough to make them. The fire had burned all night. Someone or something had walked just beyond its reach without ever breaking the stillness of their circle. Finally, one of the companions crouched, pressing his own boot beside the print as if to measure. His foot looked small against it, too small. He looked up at the others but said nothing. The silence carried more weight than speech ever could. They followed the trail a short distance. It led toward the water, where the ground grew rocky and the marks vanished. They lingered there, uncertain. To go further would have been to chase a shadow, to seek something they were not sure they wished to find. So they returned, wordless, to break camp.
All that day, the mood among them was changed. The laughter that had filled the clearing the day before was gone, replaced by long silences, by glances into the trees. The forest seemed altered too. Every bird call, every rustle of leaves overhead felt sharper, less like background music and more like messages in a language just out of reach. The old man's eyes reflected the fire as he spoke, and though his tone was calm, there was an edge beneath it, like the low hum of a string drawn taut. "You must understand," he said, "we were not afraid in the way children are afraid of shadows. We were older than that, though still young. It was not the fear of what is imagined, it was the fear of what is real but not yet seen, the sense that something had already stepped into our story and that it might return." They walked that day without their usual ease. The trees grew thicker, the ground softer, their packs heavier. Each sound around them was measured, tested against memory. Was that the wind in the branches, or footsteps behind? Was that crack the fall of a branch, or something pressing too close? The forest did not answer. It only listened and echoed. When they paused to rest, no one lingered far from the others. The youngest, once so eager to dart ahead, now stayed close, his eyes scanning the spaces between the trees. Even laughter, when it came, was quick and thin, vanishing almost before it began. By evening, they found themselves at the edge of another clearing, smaller than the first, where the ground dipped into a hollow thick with ferns. It was beautiful in its way, a place where the last light lingered in soft green, but none of them remarked on it. They built their fire quickly, their movements precise, as though some unspoken urgency guided their hands. The flames leapt high at first, and they let them, grateful for the barrier of light. As the night grew darker, they set closer to the fire than before. Shadows pressed around the edges of the clearing, deep and absolute. The stream was gone now, its music replaced by the occasional sigh of the wind. That sigh grew louder at times, bending branches overhead, making them sway like dark figures leaning close. Each gust sent sparks upward, a fleeting storm of fireflies against the black. It was then, he said, that they heard it again. Not the prince this time, but the sound that had preceded them, a wheat on the leaves, slow, careful, deliberate. The circle of the fire seemed smaller that night, its light too shallow. Each of them leaned forward unconsciously, their eyes fixed on the darkness between the trees, though nothing ever revealed itself. The sound came and went, never close, never far, a rhythm without pattern. They did not speak of it, not even in whispers. Words would have shattered the fragile line they held between vigilance and dread. Instead, they let the fire do their speaking, feeding it, stoking it, building it higher until the flames rose bright enough to keep the night at bay. Yet even as the fire grew, the sound did not fade. It lingered, shifting with the wind, circling, always circling. The man stopped here in his telling, letting the coals pop softly between us. His eyes lifted to the darkness beyond our campfire, as though searching for something there, or remembering. His silence held its own weight, one that made the forest around us seem thicker, the night more alive. And then, finally, he said, "That was the second night, and it was the first time we understood we were not alone in those woods." The second night had been long, he said, not measured in hours, but in the spaces between sounds. Every crack of a branch, every whisper of the wind, each distant hoot of an owl drew itself out, stretching time into something elastic. They sat close, closer than before, their knees almost touching, the fire between them, their single island of certainty. The flames licked upward, casting brief shadows on the trunks around them, tall and shifting like watchful figures. The air grew cooler as the hours passed, and the breath of the forest seemed to deepen, a collective exhale through branches and needles. Each man felt it in his chest, in the slow, unsteady beat of his heart. It was the eldest among them who broke the silence first. He did not speak loudly. He did not need to. His words were like the crack of a dried twig in the quiet. "It circles," he said. The others did not answer, but they had known it too. The sound, always beyond sight, had never moved straight toward them. Instead, it traced the edges of their fire's glow, a path both cautious and deliberate, sometimes nearer, sometimes farther, but always around. The youngest pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders. His eyes, wide in the firelight, flicked toward the darkness and then back to the flames, unwilling to linger long on either. The man telling me the story said he could still see that look, even now, after so many years. a mixture of defiance and fear, of wanting to believe in ordinary explanations, but feeling the truth press against his ribs. The night dragged on. They fed the fire steadily, not out of need for warmth, but for light. Sparks climbed upward with each addition of wood, vanishing into the black. Sometimes, in that breathless moment after the sparks died, the forest seemed to lean closer. And then, without warning, the sound stopped.
The silence that followed was heavier than noise, heavier than the weight of the packs on their backs or the burden of the trail. They listened, each of them poised as if on the edge of a precipice. But nothing came. No rustle, no step, not even the sigh of the wind. The forest had folded in on itself, still and watchful. Minutes passed, perhaps hours. Their sense of time slipped away, dissolved into the waiting. Some of them dozed for moments, only to start awake at the faintest crackle of the fire. Others stared into the dark until their eyes burned, until shapes seemed to form and dissolve just beyond the reach of the flames. When the first faint gray of dawn touched the treetops, they stirred at last, their bodies stiff, their minds clouded with half-dreams. The fire had dwindled to embers, but they dared not let it go out entirely. They fed it one last stick, watching the flame rise weakly, as though reluctant to return after such a night. The forest, too, seemed reluctant to wake. The birds were slower to call, their songs tentative, as if testing whether the silence had truly lifted. The light seeped down through the branches, pale and cautious, revealing nothing. And then, the prints. They were there again, pressed into the damp earth just beyond the edge of camp. Fresh, too fresh to have been relics from the night before. The trails circled them once more, looping through the ferns, vanishing toward the trees. This time they followed farther. The ground dipped, the soil growing darker, the prints clearer. Wide, deep, unmistakable. The old man's voice lowered as he described them, as though the memory itself required reverence. He traced the shape of one print in the air between us, palms spread wide. They followed until the marks disappeared into a patch of undergrowth, the soil too firm to hold impressions. There the trail ended, as abruptly as it had begun. No broken branches to show where the figure had passed, no scuff of moss or torn leaf, just absence, as though the presence that had walked with them had simply stepped away, leaving no trace but questions. One of them swore softly, another shook his head, unwilling to believe what his eyes had shown him. The eldest pressed his lips tight, holding back words that might break whatever fragile peace remained among them. They returned to camp in silence, packed their things, doused the fire, and when they set out once more, their steps were slower, heavier, though not from the weight of their packs. All that day, the forest felt closer, the air thicker, the paths less certain. They found themselves glancing back more often than ahead, measuring not only the distance they had traveled, but the distance between them and whatever shadow lingered at their backs. The man stopped here, his gaze drifting into the embers as though reading patterns in their glow. For a long moment, he said nothing, and the forest around us seemed to lean in, waiting for him to continue. At last, he drew a breath. "That was when we knew," he said, his voice low. "The forest was not empty, and it had taken notice of us." The trail through the woods that day was long and winding,
and though the sun climbed high, its warmth never quite touched them. The canopy above was thick, filtering the light into pale ribbons that never lingered on their skin. The forest felt older here, as though the trees had stood long before them and would stand long after, watching without judgment, but with memory. They spoke little as they walked. Words seemed to dissolve into the air before they reached one another. Each man kept his gaze moving from path to shadow to branch, listening for the sound that had haunted them in the night. But the forest gave nothing, only the steady rhythm of their own footsteps, the occasional snap of a twig beneath their weight. By evening, they came to a rise where the land fell away into a shallow valley. There, in the hollow below, stood a scatter of ancient pines, their trunks bent and scarred by storms. Among them lay a flat stretch of ground, soft with needles, where the stream from the previous day reappeared, trickling gently between stones. It was a place that should have felt safe, almost inviting. And yet, as they descended, each of them felt it, a hesitation, a reluctance, as though they were crossing into a space that was not entirely theirs to claim. Still, they needed rest, and the stream offered water, and the ground offered shelter. They set their packs down, their hands moving automatically, weary from the day. The fire was smaller this time, built with careful hands but less heart. They sat close, the circle tighter now, their shoulders brushing when they leaned. The flames crackled softly, painting the trunks around them in fleeting gold. But the shadows between those trunks seemed darker than they should have been, as though the firelight could not quite reach them. It was there, in that uneasy half-light, that the sound returned. Faint at first, almost a memory, a shift in the leaves, a breath against the ferns. They froze, their faces turning as one. The fire popped, a spark leaping upward, and in that brief flash they thought, or imagined, that they saw movement at the edge of the clearing, a shape that was gone as quickly as it had appeared, too fast for certainty, too vague for denial. The sounds circled them again, slower now, more deliberate, as though whatever watched had grown bolder with each night. Sometimes nearer, sometimes farther, but always there, threading the silence with its quiet presence. One of them whispered sharp and low, "Who's there?" No answer. The forest absorbed the words, swallowed them whole, gave nothing back.
They stoked the fire higher, but the light seemed to shrink instead of grow. The flames danced fiercely, yet the shadows leaned in, bending closer. Time thickened. They lost track of how long they sat like that, waiting, listening, the sound circling, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was like the pause before a storm, not empty, but heavy. The stream trickled, the fire hissed, but those were small things. The silence behind them was vast. The eldest among them lifted his head slowly, as though sensing something the others could not. His eyes searched the dark, his jaw tight, and then he whispered, so quietly that the others barely caught it. "It isn't walking anymore." A shiver passed through them at those words. They listened, straining, their ears aching for sound. And that was when they realized what he meant. The presence was still there, close, too close. But it no longer moved. It was standing, watching. The fire crackled,
spitting sparks into the night. None of them dared to speak. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. The forest, the stream, the earth beneath them, all waiting, suspended in that single unbearable moment. And then, just as suddenly, it was gone. No footstep, no rustle, nothing. The silence returned, but it was different now. Deeper, heavier, as though the absence itself had weight. They did not sleep that night, not truly. They dozed in shifts, their eyes snapping open at the faintest sound, their hands reaching instinctively for sticks of wood to feed the fire. Dawn was a mercy when it came, spilling pale light over the valley, loosening the grip of the shadows. When they rose, their faces drawn, their eyes hollow from sleeplessness, they found no prints this time. Nothing disturbed the soft bed of needles, no mark to prove what they had felt so strongly. And that, he said, was almost worse. For proof would have been something they could hold, something they could argue over, measure, deny. But nothing left them only with knowing, and no way to explain. The old man's voice fell quiet then. He leaned back from the fire, his face half-shadowed, his eyes reflecting the last glow of the embers. For a long moment, he let the silence grow, heavy and absolute, until it felt as though the forest itself leaned closer to hear. He said at last, that was the end of the second night. But it was only the beginning of what followed, for the third night was when the forest began to answer us back.
That's it for today. Sleep well. Thank you for being with me. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and hit that like button. See you tomorrow.